The standard answer to what consciousness is goes something like this. Your brain is made of tissue, electrical signals, chemical reactions, nothing more exotic than that. And then somehow out of all of that wiring you get you, the thing that's aware, the thing that's watching me talk right now. And the assumption basically all of modern medicine runs on is that the brain makes it like a factory. Chemistry goes in one end and consciousness comes out the other. Shut the factory down and the brain dies, and that's it. Production stops, and you stop. But there's another idea that says something completely different. What if the brain doesn't make consciousness? What if it's more like a radio that receives it? A radio doesn't create the music that's playing through it. It picks up the signal that's already out there in the air and turns it into something you can hear. Break the radio and the music stops coming through the speakers, but the broadcast is still happening. The station's still on the air. You just can't pick it up anymore. Through most of our history, this was just a philosophical argument that had no way to test it. But then in the 1980s, a Dutch cardiologist started stumbling into data that provided more credibility to this concept. His name was Pim van Lommel, and his own patients are what got him started down this path. People that he personally brought back from cardiac arrest kept telling him about things they experienced while their hearts were stopped. And Van Lommel, a cardiologist, someone whose entire career runs on hard evidence, didn't have anything in his training that explained what he was hearing. So in 1988, he set up a prospective study, which means he designed the study before it was administered. And that's important because it means he wasn't picking up data from people that experienced something years ago. He had a system in place to catch the data as it happened. 344 patients in 10 hospitals across the Netherlands, all of them clinically dead with their heart stopped and no circulation. When your heart stops, the EEG, which is the readout of your brain's electrical activity, goes completely flat within about 15 seconds, and it stays flat the entire time you're being resuscitated. Every one of those 344 patients had a flat EEG for the period they were clinically dead with no measurable brain activity, and 18% of them came back describing something anyway. 41 of them, 12%, described what Van Lommel called a core experience, a tunnel, a light, watching their life play back. A feeling of being completely connected to everything around them, no fear at all, and not wanting to come back. He published that study in The Lancet in 2001. The Lancet is one of the 2 or 3 more respected medical journals on the planet. Van Lommel didn't stop at the numbers, though. He wanted to know what actually caused these experiences. How long someone was in cardiac arrest? 2 minutes, 8 minutes, no difference. The medications they've been given, no pattern. The oxygen levels, no pattern. Whether they were religious beforehand. Atheists had these experiences at about the same rate as people who went to church every week. And whether they ever heard the term near-death experience before. People who've never heard it describe the exact same tunnel and the exact same light as people who had been reading about it for years. So none of that really explained anything. His conclusion, published in The Lancet, was that he could not find a physical, psychological, or chemical reason for what these people went through. And that's what he spent the rest of his career trying to make sense of. If the brain produces consciousness, how does anyone experience anything when the brain isn't doing anything? And his answer was the radio idea again. He proposed that the brain doesn't produce consciousness at all. It receives it, and filters it down to whatever you need to get through a normal day. Turn the radio off and the music stops coming through the speakers, but the radio station is still broadcasting. And he called it non-local consciousness. So if Van Lommel was right, you'd expect better instruments to eventually catch more of what that actually looks like. And 20 years later, that's exactly what happened. A doctor named Sam Parnia at NYU ran a study called AWARE 2. 567 cardiac arrest patients across 25 hospitals. This time they had brain monitors and oxygen sensors running the entire time, the whole way through CPR. The most equipped study of its kind that's ever been done. About 20% of patients described what they called the recalled experience of death. These were lucid and structured and closer to an actual memory than a dream. Deep into CPR, well past the point where the brain should be doing anything at all. And a number of these patients showed organized activity across gamma, delta, theta, and alpha waves. Gamma waves specifically are what show up when someone is actively thinking or actively perceiving something. Like they were forming a memory in real time. How was that present in people whose hearts stopped beating? Parnia's team looked at that and said these experiences don't fit the category of dreams, hallucinations, or delusions. Whatever they are, our current understanding doesn't have a place for them. There's a third piece of this that comes from a neuroscientist named Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan. She wasn't studying near-death experiences specifically. She was studying what the brain actually does when someone dies. What she found is that right at the moment of death, the brain doesn't just fade out the way you'd expect. It surges. A spike in gamma activity, and the regions tied to memory and conscious experience suddenly get more connected to each other. In some cases, they're more connected than they were when the person was awake and healthy. I think there's two ways to interpret that. One of them is that this is the brain's last burst before it shuts down completely, like a light bulb's bright flash right before it burns out. And the vividness that people describe afterwards is just that flash. And the other one is that's the moment the brain stops filtering. Whatever consciousness actually is, it stops being squeezed through that narrow channel and goes back to being whatever it was before that filter was even there. No one can prove either one, but the data does fit both interpretations. There is a more grounded explanation for a lot of this, and I think it deserves a little bit of discussion. It starts with chemistry. As the brain runs low on oxygen, what's called anoxia, it can produce tunnel vision, vivid imagery, a sense of calm. Some researchers point to a natural DMT experience, a powerful psychedelic the body may release under extreme stress. Imperial College in London actually tested this directly. They gave healthy volunteers DMT in a controlled setting and compared what they experienced against the documented near-death accounts. And there was a big overlap. Tunnel sensations, leaving the body, encountering some kind of presence. DMT produced a lot of the same descriptions. But there's a problem with using anoxia as the full explanation, because every one of those 344 patients in Van Lommel's study experienced the same drop in oxygen. That's what cardiac arrest is. If lack of oxygen alone caused these experiences, you'd expect close to 100% of survivors to report the same thing. Instead, it's 18%. Something is separating that 18% from everyone else, and nobody's identified what that something is. There's also the perception question. Sometimes people describe seeing or hearing specific things happening around their own body while they're unconscious. So researchers built a direct test for this. The AWARE studies placed hidden images near the ceiling in resuscitation areas, positioned specifically where only someone having an out-of-body view from above could possibly see them. Across both AWARE studies, no one that was ever interviewed identified any of those images. But to be fair, very few patients survived those experiences at all. And even fewer happened to be positioned correctly during the right window to even see the target. So that test is brutally hard to run outside of the lab setting. There's a separate body of testimony. A 2023 compilation gathered over 100 cases where hospital staff independently corroborated patients describing something specific they shouldn't have been able to see or know. But that's all anecdotal. Even taking all of those conclusions and interpretations seriously, there's still a timing problem that no one's actually explained. In 2022, researchers came up with new terminology specifically for this: recalled experience of death. The whole point of that was to separate it from meditation, hallucination, or drug experiences, because again and again this comes up as a lucid, memory-forming thing that happens during a period when the EEG shows absolutely no activity. There's no activity to form a memory, but there is a memory there afterwards, and they're able to describe it the same way decades later. So if something really is happening beyond oxygen levels and brain chemistry, the next question is, does it look the same for everybody? Or does it depend on what's already going on in someone's head? A researcher named Charlotte Marshall in Belgium studied near-death experiences across different countries, different religions, and people with no religious belief at all. And the structure of what they all describe is the same. The tunnel, the light, watching your life play back, some kind of experience, the feeling of total peace, and a boundary. A point where if you cross it, you don't come back. What changes is what's standing there. A Christian will say that they saw Jesus. A different tradition describes a figure from their own background. Someone with no religion at all describes a being made of light with no name and no specific identity. The structure always stays the same, but what fills in the blanks depends on where you're from. About 42% of people who have these experiences describe feeling completely unified with everything around them, completely merged with it, like the line between themselves and everything else just wasn't there anymore. And the life review part is pretty strange. People don't describe being judged by someone else. They describe it as going through their own life again, except from the other person's point of view, feeling the hurt they caused or the good as if it happened to them directly. Whatever sense of right and wrong comes from inside that experience itself, like no one's handing down a verdict. Van Lommel followed up with his patients 2 years later, then again at 8 years. The ones who had these experiences were less afraid of dying, cared less about status or money, cared more about the people around them, and 8 years later, it was still there. And it didn't track with whether they were religious to begin with. People with no religion at all came back changed in the exact same ways. There's one more name worth mentioning here because his work is what made all of this measurable in the first place. Bruce Greyson is a psychiatrist who spent decades at the University of Virginia studying the subject. In 1983, he built something called the Greyson NDE scale. And before that, researchers were just basically comparing notes informally. No two studies measuring the same thing the same way. Greyson built a standardized set of questions that let you score how deep and how consistent an experience actually was. And that scale is the same main tool researchers use today, including in Van Lommel's and Parnia's studies. Grayson didn't start out trying to prove anything paranormal. He started out trying to bring some actual structures to a field that really didn't have any. And along the way, he ran into cases that got his attention. He talks about a patient named Al Sullivan, who during heart surgery and while unconscious with his eyes taped shut, accurately described a specific hand gesture his surgeon made during the operation to indicate which artery to use. A gesture that had nothing to do with the actual surgical procedure and that Sullivan had no normal way of seeing. Grayson's position after decades of this isn't that he's proven an afterlife exists. His position is that the current explanation, the one where the brain simply produces consciousness, doesn't account for what he's been documenting. He thinks something's missing, but he doesn't claim to know what that something is. Back in the 1890s, a Harvard psychologist named William James, one of the people who basically built the entire field of psychology, put forward the idea that the brain doesn't generate consciousness, it transmits it. The same idea we talked about earlier. This was just way before anyone had any data to actually test it. And a few decades after that, Aldous Huxley referenced the same idea in a book called The Doors of Perception. He called the brain a reducing valve. He thinks the brain's job is to take an enormous amount of consciousness and trim it down to a manageable stream just enough to get through your day. Find food, avoid danger, and stay focused on what's in front of you. If that valve opens wider through something like trauma or meditation or dying, more of whatever's actually there gets through. Around the same time Huxley was releasing that book, a philosopher named Henry Bergson, who won a Nobel Prize, was arguing something almost identical, that memory and consciousness aren't generated inside the skull. The brain limits them. It doesn't build them from scratch. And none of those three were talking about near-death experiences. They were working from completely different angles, long before Van Lomel's study even existed. And then decades later, the actual medical data pointed to that exact same place. Einstein, late in his life, wrote about something similar from the physics side. The sense that one person being separate from everything else is kind of an illusion. And just last year in 2025, a paper in a physics journal called AIP Advances put forward the idea that consciousness may have existed before the Big Bang. Not something that matter actually produced, but something that matter actually exists inside of. It took me a minute to wrap my brain around that one. And then there's a book from 1995 that kind of fits into all of this. It's a very controversial book, and I want to call that out because it's one person's accounts and none of them can be validated. It's called Conversations with God by a man named Neale Donald Walsch. The premise is that he was going through a very difficult time in his life. He started writing an angry letter and he felt like he was getting answers back from somewhere outside of himself. A lot of the criticism of that is fair. People who have read it point out that the version of God in that book sounds a lot like Walsch himself. His opinions, his particular way of seeing things. But set that aside for a second and look at what the book actually describes. God in this book isn't described as a being that's just sitting up on a cloud watching and judging. He's described as the awareness that everything is made of. That's close to word for word what people that have had near-death experiences describe when they say they felt unified with everything. It's what Van Lommel was getting at with non-local consciousness. It's what James and Huxley and Bergson were describing as whatever's on the other side of the brain's filter. It's what the 2025 physics paper is pointing at. And I'm thinking more and more that consciousness is just something that we're tuned into. Our physical frequency determines how we perceive things. But this time it's what station are you tuned to? Is it rock or is it country? They both come from the same medium, but they'll provide different perspectives on how you'll view the world. If you want to go deeper on any of this, Van Lommel wrote a book called Consciousness Beyond Life that covers all of this directly. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia wrote one called After. And if you're interested in conversations with God, despite everything I just said about it, it's worth reading for the idea sitting at the center of it. I'll link all those books in the description for you. So at the end of the day, what do you think consciousness actually is? Do you think it's individual to each one of us, or do you think we're all sharing some type of universal consciousness and our brains are the filter that gives us our perception? And thinking through some of this stuff got a little introspective for me when I was like, well, what does this really mean? What's going to happen when we depart this place? And the older I get, the more I start thinking about that, and I want some answers. Or do I? I don't really know if I want the answer to that question. I might just want to leave it up to fate, live the best life I can while I'm here, and when that time comes, whatever happens, hopefully I did the right things to put me in the right spot. As always, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate you watching. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, like, and drop that comment. I'd love to hear what your thoughts on universal consciousness are. But until next time, I'll talk to you later.